I have written a great deal about China and its moves away from the Anglo-American Empire. They are establishing what I call the anti-hegemon, a group of non-intellectually or racially aligned nations that do not benefit from the current world order of the petrodollar and the debt and death empire that enables. When you look at the nations of the anti-hegemon, Russia, China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Venezuela, Iran, Syria, and many other nations, you start to see that these nations have so much to gain from the collapse of this current world order. They have huge populations, land masses, and natural resources of the world. China has led this charge by going around the world offering business deals and development instead of the typical debt and death that the Anglo-American Empire spreads. This has allowed China to strike bilateral trade deals where nations that have been using the dollar since Bretton Woods as the reserve currency are now dumping these dollars in favor of their own currencies in bilateral trade. This has been done with anti-hegemon allies like China and Russia, but the disturbing trend is now long-term allies of the Anglo-American Empire are accepting this deal with the likes of bilateral trade dumping of the dollar of China with nations like Japan, Australia, and even England. The currency war is just a shell game for the real resource war that is going on. If you watch the players on the chessboard what they're doing, they're taking their fake fiat currencies to capture the human and natural resources of the world. For example, when China moves into Africa with massive development deals they announced at the last BRICS conference in South Africa, while the United States continues to use predator drones and spying to intimidate the world into playing along their game.
What difference at this point does it make?
At some point, the currency war will flare into the real asset war. The Anglo-American Empire cannot exist very long if there is any viable alternative to their debt and death paradigm. The petrodollar must constantly recycle these worthless dollars through the Anglo-American oil and banking interests to give the dollar value. But the nations of the world are waking up to the massive advantage the United States enjoys by having this world's reserve currency. We have for decades printed more and more debt and merely exported all of it as inflation to the rest of the world while we capture the human and natural resources of the world in exchange. We don't even need to work, especially when we can run up unlimited debt and then use our military-industrial complex to kill anybody who gets any bright ideas. That is the real reason why we invaded Iraq. In the year 2000, Saddam dumped the dollar trade for oil in favor of the euro. Saddam did this not necessarily for financial reasons, although it proved very successful, but because he said that he, quote, did not want to deal in the currency of the enemy. By 2003, we had invaded Iraq and returned all oil exchange back into dollars. The real reason why we attacked Gaddafi in Libya was that he was moving the Middle East North Africa region to a gold dinar standard that would also threaten the dollar.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, oh, I'm sure it did.
The real reason why we're going after Iran has nothing to do with their nuclear program. It is because Iran is selling oil for any currency, including gold, for oil on the Isle of Kish. Our debt and death empire does not work without a constant creation of debt forced onto the willing and unwilling of the world. I created the Silver Bullet and Silver Shield as a conscious solution to these collectivist problems. As an individual, you can recognize the evil of this unsustainable, unnatural paradigm and defeat it by simply taking away our capital and consent from the system. This will ultimately topple the generational, debt-based counterparty risk Ponzi scheme that the dollar has now become. The investment into real skills, real friends, and real asset will act as a shield against the single largest event in human history, the collapse of the dollar and the world's currencies and markets that depend on it. What I find most amazing is that it would seem that the nations of the world, specifically the anti-hegemon nations, are almost following the principles of what I'm encouraging individuals to do with the Silver Bullet and Silver Shield. Nations are not necessarily confronting the United States, but walking away from them, saying that they no longer wish to play their games. They are currently draining the Western powers of their real assets and returning their fiat promises back into their markets. With this in mind, I want to share with you the largest event I've seen in the silver market. Now, we know that the imports of gold to China have been accelerating at a feverish pace this year despite the drop in paper price. According to Zero Hedge, the latest news from China is that they imported 223 tons of gold in March, and that was even before the recent price collapse. That amount is the equivalent of the entire gold production of the Earth for that month. and this is just what they admit to. But what is even more exciting to me, specifically for silver, a reader of mine forwarded me to this article from India about India's recent big move into silver. India has always been a major buyer of gold due to the decade-long inflationary environment and currency destruction of the rupee at the hands of the government. More recently, Indians have been accelerating their purchases of precious metals. This mainly due to the idiotic government that they've been trying to suppress the importation of gold because, quote, it exaggerates their trade imbalance. This is so ridiculous since Indians are importing real wealth and exporting fiat promises. And when they import this, they're doing it with gold and silver, not cheap Walmart toys like the United States has been doing. India has typically been the largest importer of gold, and only recently surpassed by China. China is now the largest importer and producer of gold in the world, and since they don't export any gold, it will be stunning to see how much gold they actually have. It now seems that the Indian government is applying pressure on loans and the importation of gold, and that Indians are now moving a ton of wealth into silver. It is estimated that the entire world production of silver every year is 25,000 tons, or about 2,000 tons a month. According to this article of the Business Standard, India imported an estimated 250 tons each month, January, February, and March of this year, despite the collapse of the price of silver. But in April, they imported 720 tons of silver. But even more stunning than that, they imported more in April than they did the first 3 months of this year. But even more stunning than that, in May, the number even accelerated even further to 920 tons of silver, or nearly half of the entire world's production that month. So while the rest of the world is focused on the massive demand that China is bringing into gold, most of the gold that's ever been mined is still in bullion form. But the fact that silver's stockpiles have been destroyed, so much so that the United States Geological Survey has estimated that by 2020, silver will become the first element on the periodic chart to become extinct, unless there is a massive change in price that would bring on more production or the wiser use of the stockpiles there. So when you see India making huge moves into this is amazing. To put this recent Indian demand into perspective, over the past 2 months of April and May, India imported 1,640 tons of silver. That's the equivalent of 52 million ounces of silver. Those 2 months of sales are double the first 6 months of sale of the record-setting pace of the Silver Eagle production of the U.S. Mint, that for the first 6 months of this year have sold 24 million ounces of silver. This is stunning, especially considering the amount of wealth that's flowing over to Asia and how their move into silver is going to destroy the current gold to silver ratio of 1 to 65. More dollars are flowing into silver on a relative basis than the exchange ratio will be able to maintain for very long. This screams to me that we're on the verge of something huge. If one has an intellectually honest look at the world history, it would see that for most of recorded civilization, China was the wealthiest nation in the world because it traded the most with the world. At one point, China had accumulated 25% of the world's silver, even though it had no natural production of its own. They did this through trade. The Western world was forced to look for trade routes and also provide value to Asia after repeatedly draining their wealth in wars and trade. While the Western powers were looking for faster trade routes, they stumbled upon the New World and then proceeded to rape the local inhabitants of their natural resources. Gold and silver flooded into Europe, building up tremendous cities and wealth. This provided the real capital and basis for the Industrial Revolution that created value on top of the raw commodities. The Europeans used this power to colonize more nations of the world. Despite the growing power of the Western nations, India and China still had a tremendous amount of wealth. But the British had to resort to dominating the Indian subcontinent and then resorted to importing opium from their Indian colonies through the most evil company in the world, the British East India Company, to settle the massive silver debts that they had with China. This led to 2 opium wars, as the British used opium to get back the silver that was drained from them through fair trade. Once the Opium Wars were over, Western, and specifically the Anglo-American power, was in ascension. Due to 2 world wars, the real gold and silver that was stolen from the rest of the world through colonialism and war was moved to America to be safe. This led to the emergence of the American power that now superseded the Anglo power. We are now at the end of this American power, as the real wealth is once again being drained from one nation to another. The irony is most of this wealth is now going back to where it once was. The next stage is not going to be like this past age. And you don't have to fall victim to this single largest transfer of wealth from west to east, or from intangible counterparty risk assets in this debt-based Ponzi scheme to real tangible wealth. The silver bullet and the silver shield will withdraw capital and consent from things that do not resonate with you and provide a real basis for wealth when new values are imposed on those that now have the gold and silver.